This video was digitized from 4 reels of film that came from a U.S. Air Force officer by the name of Herbert H. Johnson. And the first 3 were marked Vietnam 1970, and the 4th one marked Vietnam 1972. And Herbert Johnson spent most of his time in Hickam Air Force Base around this time period, I believe, just from other films that I have from him in this collection. So I don't know if he was, actually stationed here in Vietnam or just here on a, temporary assigned duty from Hickam. But I believe we're starting off in Da Nang here. Definitely the 1972 film is Da Nang, and I marked where the 1972 film starts, so you'll know. And it looks like a couple F-4 Phantoms coming in, landing here. And then when we, after the footage here at probably Da Nang, we're going to transition into a road trip as they drive. Looks probably, if this is Da Nang, just from the footage, they're probably traveling south along the coast, and then we'll get into the 1972 footage, which is definitely of Da Nang and seems to center around the 15th Aerial Port Squadron there, and them loading up looks like a C-130 from the 3rd Tactical Fighter Wing, which was stationed out of Ben Ho Air Base. So probably loading it up there in Da Nang to go resupply the base there at Ben Ho. But now you can see we're into the road trip here, and just some really interesting footage, and love to hear your comments, and hope you enjoy this look at the U.S. Air Force in Vietnam in 1970 and 72. I hope you enjoyed this bit of history. Try to upload military and patriotic videos to my site here, about every other day. And if you're interested in a good read, check out my books at www.edsemler.com.